Ever since I could remember, I loved going into old houses, abandoned factories, and jumping the fences of properties where even the warnings to keep out were being swallowed by time. Now, I sort of got into this hobby by accident. When I was a teenager, I grew up in the Midwest, in a big city. There were some really old parts of town, and our city was caught up in the dot-com boom of the mid-90s. So there were an awful lot of old apartment complexes that had been condemned in the downtown area, and quite a few brown brick office buildings that were just falling apart. 3 friends and I spent a few summers playing the "I'm sleeping at John's house," while John tells his parents he's sleeping at your house. Since we had just gotten cell phones at the time, we were in absolutely no fear of getting caught. At first, it started out as bravado, daring each other to go into a creepy old building after dark and bring something out. But then, out of the group of 5 guys I hung out with, 3 of us discovered that unlike the other 2, we weren't into petty vandalism and the thrill of showing off to your friends that you weren't afraid of anything. The 3 of us, John and Mike and myself, would spend hours combing through old cellars and carefully climbing broken stairwells to get into rooms that hadn't quite been picked clean by vagrants and squatters. We were thrilled by trying to reconstruct the lives of the people who had lived or worked in these places, and guessing under what circumstances they left these belongings behind. We wondered where they were today and what they were doing, and so it became tradition for 4 summers that the 3 of us would find new places to explore, do research on the buildings first at the library, then when the time was right, head out and break in. We had some close calls those summers, near misses with the police, encounters with private security, 1 or 2 altercations with the homeless, and at one point, John had to get tetanus shots and get a cast put on when his foot went through a dry, rotted step on an old stairwell. After the 4th summer, though, we all went our own separate ways. John went to college on the East Coast, I went into the Air Force, and Mike stayed at home to attend community college, eventually dropping out and joining the Navy. For 6 years, I did my time in the military, fondly shelving my urban explorer days. I got out of the Air Force and started going to college myself. 2 semesters in a row, and I was pretty well done with it. I was sick to death of it, and I felt like I had absolutely no life outside of school. But because of a combination of financial aid, GI Bill, a part-time job, and no life outside of school to speak of, I suddenly realized that I had $12,000 left over to survive the 2.5-month summer break. At first, I decided I should take some time off of work, so I called my boss and asked whether he would be willing to hold my position for 2 months while I did some traveling and took some much-needed R&R. He was game and told me that he'd love to have me back after the summer. During my multiple cross-country drives, I discovered an old, abandoned hydroelectric power plant on the East Coast via the internet. There were rumors of vagrants living in the maze of tunnels beneath it. Much of the surface infrastructure had been torn down in the 120 years since the project was begun. The plant was initially supposed to be a lot bigger than it was, so there were tons of underground areas that had been excavated and never fully finished. Locals actually told stories that parts of the place were haunted. I had another month left on my vacation and wanted to spend a few days up there, casing the place and exploring it, just like the old days. So there I am, both of my old fellow adventurers comfortably at home, having left their sense of wonder behind them. I should have known then what I discovered inside of that plant. You never go alone. But in all the summers we had spent exploring the places our society chooses to forget about, we never ran into anything that was truly scary. A drunk, high vagrant, or squatter? Not really anything to worry about. Police or security? They are just as afraid of an abandoned building at night as nearly everyone else. This was my world. This was my hobby. And I thought I knew what I was doing. Even so, the thought of potentially getting lost underground in abandoned tunnels did give me some pause. So I stopped in by a sporting goods store and a Walmart, bought some glow sticks, some chalk, some pepper spray, and just in case anything went wrong, and I got stuck underground for a few days, 2 canteens and some dehydrated food. I even called Mike and let him know when I was planning on going down, gave him the number to the local police department, and told him that if I didn't contact him within 36 hours, to report exactly where I had gone and what I was doing. My first stop the day before the trip was to the city planner's office. I had called them now 2 weeks before and put in a request for copies of the blueprints to the power station, and had been informed that since the building was now publicly curated, there were no restrictions on receipt of the blueprints. I had faxed in a formal request, and they said I could come in to pick them up when I got to the area. They, of course, asked what my interest was, and I lied, stating that I was interested in the building as a part of a documentary I was putting together on green energy in the United States. They didn't seem suspicious and were actually quite helpful. After the city planner's office, I drove by the plant, but noticed that they had 14-foot fences with razor wire up all around the perimeter. I saw some fairly modern trucks on the premises and decided that the site of the pump station wasn't going to be good for exploration. It was the tunnels I wanted. I was starting to get pretty confident that I wouldn't get lost in the canals, and even spent the rest of the day combing through old newspaper articles at the local public library for information on the power plant. That's when my nerves started to turn against me. At first, in the early 1900s, there were reports of workers dying. Now, to put this in perspective, workers die all the time. This isn't abnormal at all. But the way these workers were dying was mysterious. They were said to have simply collapsed in the canals. Some died from machinery malfunctions and collapses in the tunnel, yes. But the cases just kept getting stranger. Late during construction, one of the workers had been accused of cutting another's throat with a dull knife. He had cut it so many times that it looked like it had been torn out with his fingernails. This worker, of course, denied it vehemently, but was not able to offer an explanation that convinced the courts. He was later hanged. Then, as I kept going forward, there were financial problems with the structure. It had gone way over budget, and the company responsible was having trouble justifying why. In the end, it took nearly 3 times as long to build as it was supposed to, and the commission changed hands 3 times over this time. Throughout the 1920s to the 1960s, bodies kept washing out of the canals. An impossibly high number of bodies, almost 30 over the span of 40 years. Finally, the plant was fully shut down, but the mysterious deaths didn't stop. Bodies were found at the bypass outflows, despite the entries into the canals being sealed in the 1970s, mostly vagrants. In just what I was able to find, this plant had cost the lives of almost 100 people in just over 120 years, and that's just from what I was able to dig up in a public library in one afternoon. I was officially creeped out, but I wasn't going home. It was on toward late afternoon, so I went to an Outback steakhouse, not too far from where I was staying, and had a big late lunch, as well as ordering dinner to go. I'm glad that I started hunting for the canal inflow early in the afternoon, because I wound up having to park my car almost 10 miles from the inflow and hike some pretty rough country. Once I found the inflow, I broke out my to-go box from Outback and had dinner right there on a rock by the river. It wasn't half bad, despite the fact that it had sat in that sack for easily 3 hours. With the sun setting, I take my crowbar to the rusted padlock on the doorway leading to the maintenance causeway alongside the inflow's barred brick archway. I struggled with the deadbolt for some time, but eventually got it to move and stepped through into the canals. To this day, I wish that padlock hadn't been so easy to crack off, and I'd been forced to turn back. This place was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Whereas the other places I'd been gave me a window decades into the past, this tunnel was built in a completely different century. The bricks weren't crumbling like you see in 1930s and 1940s buildings. They were still holding their shape. The mortar was in ill repair, but there wasn't much of the stuff, unlike what you see in buildings from the 20th century, where it's just glopped in there and left to ooze out the sides. This tunnel was an absolute cathedral to me. It wasn't rounded, in fact. It had a sharp arch-like shape, and the ceiling met in a very sharp corner at the center of the tunnel. There didn't appear to be a single attempt to modernize this place in almost 50 years. I knew instantly that I was just a few minutes from seeing a place that nobody had laid eyes on since the last time that the homeless were cleared out of here, and the tunnels were barred and sealed 20 years earlier. I knew at this point, though, that I wouldn't find mementos and trinkets of others' lives, like I so loved about abandoned homes. This was purely about a place that nobody else would even be able to imagine unless they'd been there, and very likely, nobody else I'll ever meet would have been there. After what happened to me in these tunnels, though, you should be thankful you've never been. I clicked on my mag light and dropped my first glow stick right at the doorway. I knew from the plans of the building that the tunnel would be straight for almost a mile before branching off toward the various power stations. The blueprints detailed 5 branches in the tunnel, 2 of which were sealed, as the tunnels and pumping stations were never finished, and 3 of which continued to the 3 original power stations, all but 1 of which had been torn down. Everything went well for the first 6 hours I was down there. I found the branches and explored all 3. I even found what looked to be the remnants for some places a few homeless people had bunked down many years before. I found several alcoves where there were metal rungs leading to access hatches, where I determined from my blueprints led up to the various pumping station grounds. I tried each of them, but not a single one of them would budge, so I didn't have anything left to explore. I stopped and turned my mag light on lantern mode and broke out some of my dehydrated food for a quick snack before trying to see how far down the 2-block tunnels I could get. I ultimately didn't get very far down either of the unfinished tunnels, but I found a few more piles of various odds and ends, rotten magazines, a rusted-out coffee can with some playing cards in it that were covered in black mold, and literally hundreds of cigarette butts in varying states of decomposition strewn about, with a number of empty alcohol bottles. It looked like somehow or another this place had been occupied at the very most 10 years ago. I decided that the outflow had to be where the vagrants were getting in, and decided to check my theory. Looking at my blueprints, I figured that Canal 1 would be my best bet for getting into the outflow tunnel, and headed back there. I quickly found the path to the outflow tunnel by passing through a series of brick archways and kept walking, leaving behind a few glow sticks and chalk markings in the process. I didn't much fancy a 15-plus mile hike back to my car through rough country, so I figured I'd leave the way I came, by passing through the tunnel. Sure enough, the outflow drainage area had no bars on it of any sort, and was really easy to find. When I emerged from the outflow tunnel, it was dawn already, so I checked the time. I discovered while checking my phone for the time that I had signal, so I called Mike. I told him about how the entire thing was a bust. I mentioned to Mike that I was going to go back through and walk back to my car. I ended the call letting him know that I was going to walk back through the canal to get back to my car, and if I didn't call him by the afternoon, to try to get in touch with me and follow through on our plan by nightfall. I was pretty sure the tunnel was uninhabited at this point, and it'd take me less than 2 hours to walk through it, but I still didn't want to slip and fall or something stupid, and wind up being yet another person found at the mouth of the canal. I first noticed something was wrong when I hit the arches I'd left glow sticks in at Pump Station 1. Each one of them was standing upright. I had dropped the sticks, so there's no way all 3 of them could have landed upright. I stopped to look at my chalk markings on the arches. I had put the markings on the left wall, and marked them with the direction I was traveling, so I could easily reverse them in case I got turned around. Someone had scratched into the brick, faintly with a rock, on the opposite side of the arches, an arrow pointing back toward the outflow drain. The word, safe, had been scratched in once beneath the arrow on one arch, out on the second arch, and go on the third. I almost turned around at this point, but to my eternal regret, I didn't. Nothing else unusual happened while I walked back through the junction of the 5 tunnels and reached the inflow canal. Well, aside from the standing glow sticks. All of them. Every last one was standing. There were no opposite walls for other messages to be scratched into in this part of the tunnel, so I didn't see any more of that. Within 5 minutes of walking back down the inflow tunnel, something went wrong. I hit a branch in the tunnel. I immediately checked, and this branch wasn't on my blueprint. In fact, it wasn't part of the canal itself. There was no inflow here. It was a completely dry tunnel, leading off and to my left, slowly curving out of range of my flashlight. As I was shining my flashlight down the tunnel, it flickered and died. I want to be clear here, the flashlight didn't dim. It just flickered twice and died. I dropped my rucksack on the ground and pulled out some fresh batteries, but before I could get them into my flashlight, I heard a sound like a woman's laughter, high but distant, echoing off the walls of the tunnel. I just about pissed myself when I heard it. As before this, the only sound I had heard was the occasional drip of water from the ceiling into the still pool of the blocked inflow. Quickly, I got my batteries into my flashlight and dropped another glow stick, this time making sure it wasn't standing up. I stopped and listened hard for what seemed like forever, but I didn't hear anything else aside from my heart pounding in my ears. This is where I made my first mistake. I decided to check out this tunnel. I set off down the unmarked tunnel, marking with chalk on the left wall my direction of travel. If there were unmarked turns down here, I wasn't taking any chances. I followed this tunnel for an impossible distance. It just wouldn't end. I thought I was traveling parallel to the canal for a while, but then I decided I wasn't really sure. I should have brought a compass, I thought to myself. Finally, after what had to have been a half of a mile, I reached another junction. This time, left and right. I dropped a glow stick, again noting it fell on its side, and marked on my copy of the blueprint of the tunnel system where I thought I was with a pencil. I took the left turn and quickly discovered that it led to yet another junction. Before I knew it, I had made 5 turns. My supply of glow sticks were dwindling, so I decided it would be best to turn back and try this path another night. I turned around and found a standing glow stick yet again, but no chalk. Had I forgotten to mark the wall on the last turn? I could see my next glow stick in the distance, so I headed toward it. When I reached it, it was standing too. My chalk mark was gone. I reached another glow stick. No chalk. I reached another. No chalk. And another. No chalk. Then a 5th. Then a 6th. Then a 7th. An 8th. And that's when I realized that I was lost. I had bought 24 glow sticks. I quickly counted in my head how many I had dropped while I was in the tunnel. 15 is the number I came up with. I was sure of it. I dropped my rucksack again to count the number of glow sticks I had left. They were gone. A chill went down my spine. Someone was in this tunnel, and they were fucking with me. They weren't just writing shit on walls anymore. They'd followed me from the pump station into this tunnel. Either I'd dropped the glow sticks when I was fishing for batteries, or they had gotten close enough to me to get into my ruck without me noticing while I was marking a wall with chalk. Somehow they'd turned me around and were using my glow sticks to lead me through this maze-like tunnel. I got my pepper spray out and ready, and turned my flashlight down each of the 4 directions of the junction I was standing in. What was I supposed to do? Follow the glow sticks while this person gets me lost? Try to avoid the glow sticks and get myself lost? I stood there for a minute, and then decided it would be best to avoid the glow sticks and take my chances. At some point, I'd have to find the 3-way junction. I took a few turns, moving briskly, mapping the place out in my head, but within 30 minutes, I was hopelessly lost. Then, the glow sticks started showing back up, all of them standing upright. At first, the glow sticks would only be in 1 junction, and I'd avoid that one, but soon they'd be in 2 junctions. A few minutes more, and I hit a junction with 3. I turned around and headed the other way. I was becoming increasingly paranoid. I was hearing things, voices, whispers, scraping on the bricks. Imagining what that could be was making me terrified. My skin felt clammy and my stomach was doing loops. At this point, there was no avoiding the glow sticks. I was surrounded by junctions with a standing glow stick in them. I started to pick them up and collect them. 8, 9, 10, but I was still running into them everywhere. I was terrified of what would happen when I got to 20, as my chances of finding this person were getting higher and higher. But I hit 20, and nothing happened. By 22, I was nauseous from terror. At 23, I had tears streaming down my face. When I hit 24 glow sticks in my bag, I stood there for a minute looking around. That was the first time that I was standing in a junction, and each of the 4 surrounding junctions had glow sticks shining dully in the distance. How was any of this possible? What the fuck was going on? Something wasn't right. I was beyond fear at this point. I was absolutely broken. I had no other means of marking my path, and I was lost. Not only that, but I was being stalked by some unseen entity that seemed to be able to do things that simply weren't natural. I want to break here and say this. I'm a pretty hardline atheist. I'm skeptical about everything. Ghost stories are just that, stories. I don't believe in the supernatural, be it the Wolfman, or be it angels and demons. Reality is the mind being subjected to electrical impulses and storing memories of those sensory inputs in chemical relays. Senses can be deceived and memories can be false. Our memories and senses are not accurate representations of the world around us. They are merely a porthole to a subjective reality that we experience. I knew even then that logically it was hard to believe that a homeless person living in this tunnel would have just decided to fuck with me in the first place. It was even less believable that any person without the intention of exploration and trying to prevent getting lost would bring a pack of their own glow sticks down into a long-abandoned canal system. I knew all of this, but I had no explanation for what was going on. I felt perfectly sane. Overwhelmed by fear, yes, but I felt like my mind was working properly. I could explain away the missing chalk as hallucinations, but I couldn't explain the glow sticks. Why were they standing? Why were they being placed randomly like this? And who was doing it to me? I only had one more test that I could perform to confirm whether I was losing it. I had to pick up and count the 25th glow stick. I walked down the tunnel toward one of the glow sticks. I was moving slowly, looking for movement down the tunnel, swinging my flashlight wildly. My ears were strained, seeking the slightest sound. Nothing. I reached that glow stick after what felt like an eternity, leaned down and picked it up. I took off my ruck and divided my glow sticks into 5 groups of 5. I counted once, I counted twice, I counted 3 times. It kept adding up to 25. How could I possibly explain this? I don't know how long I wandered those junctions. I call them the catacombs to this day. I tried in vain to find a 3-way junction, but eventually had to stop to eat again. So I knew it had been at least 12 hours. The first time I stopped to eat, I wasn't really all that hungry. I had just wanted to take a break and enjoy a meal, but the second time I was famished. I put my back against the wall and ate with flashlight in lantern mode. The closeness of the beam in lantern mode was unnerving. I felt like something was stalking me just outside of my line of sight, reveling in my confusion and exhaustion. I didn't even bother to pack up my garbage from my dehydrated meal. I figured I could use it as a landmark, though with how the glow sticks worked, I probably wouldn't have much luck with that. That's when I first started to hear the noise that haunts me in my sleep to this day. It started off as a low hum echoing off the walls. It was hard to distinguish between a sensation and a noise. It was like the noise was a slow, low rumbling that was barely audible, but powerful enough to cause my eardrums to reverberate. Over the next few hours of walking aimlessly, it kept growing louder, closer. That humming sound began to get more distinct as time passed, and I still failed to find an outside wall for this catacomb. It felt like it was all around me. I caught movement in the beam of my flashlight and saw the outline of a man. He was wearing a dark jacket with the hood up, low over his face. I kept the light on him and realized that the sound was coming from his mouth, a low, droning humming broken by his occasional closing of his mouth. He continued to hum with his mouth closed when he did this. In his right hand, he was holding a long, heavy tree branch with what looked like nails in it. I got my pepper spray out and kept the beam on him for a minute, but then I heard the humming sound coming from the side as well, and turned my light into that junction, only to see the same man standing there, only this time in his right hand was a pipe. He was humming in exactly the same way. I moved quickly down another corridor, picking up the pace. Every time I saw this figure, I turned. The sound kept growing louder, and I could hear the scuffling of feet moving in the distance. It sounded like there were a dozen people all moving around me and trying to corner me, but I was running now. That's when it finally happened. I hit a three-way junction. In an alcove on the back wall, there was a small wooden door with iron rivets. I stepped through it into what was obviously a cellar of some sort. I didn't care where I was, as long as it was away from that noise and those people. I bolted the door to the catacombs and moved into the basement. There were boxes everywhere, covered in tarps. It was musty down there, but it had seen some use recently. The basement was pretty old-looking, though. I immediately thought I was in a church. The floor was some pretty old-looking flagstone. There were pillars all over the room, and in the corner there was a stone stairway leading upward. I quickly got my bearings and headed upstairs and found myself in a short hallway. The walls were clean and the carpet was in good repair. I called out, "Hello, I'm lost," and was very shortly greeted with a woman's voice. "Of course you are, dear." She emerged from what appeared to be a study. I was in the back offices of the church, in the hallway between the parishioner's chamber and the library, which was really no more than a few bookshelves and a single table. Her face was definitely wizened by the years. I would say she probably looked to be in her late 60s. She looked at me and smiled. "Can't find your way out?" "No, ma'am. I was exploring the canals for the old hydroelectric plant and got lost in these sort of catacombs that weren't on my map. I then thought about mentioning all the terrifying things that went on down there while I was lost, but thought better of it. I found the door that led into your basement. Where am I?" She continued smiling and replied, "Exactly where you need to be. You are only a mile from one of the old plants, so you haven't gone far." She motioned for me to follow her into the study. I quickly took my boots off as I stepped out of the basement, as they were absolutely filthy. "If you'd like some coffee before you go, I'd be happy to serve you," she called out from the study as I strung my boots up to my rucksack. At that moment, I was so glad to be above ground that I didn't question this woman's kindness for even a minute. I just assumed that she was an old church lady and pictured herself the model of hosts. I should have been surprised that she would have so calmly reacted to how I emerged from the basement of her church. I should have questioned the strange way she was speaking to me, but I assumed that she was trying to weave biblical meaning into what she said to me. Of course I was lost, and if I were lost, of course I was where I was supposed to be, by finding a church. I assumed she was being a religious nut, rather than legitimately creepy, but it makes my blood curdle when I look back at it. She sat me down with a cup of coffee, and we talked a bit about my exploration of the old pump station. I explained that somehow I'd found a tunnel that led into these bizarre catacombs that shouldn't have been there. Nothing that I had read about the plant mentioned anything like these tunnels. Over the course of the conversation, I became increasingly uneasy. I realized that this woman didn't seem all that old. She looked maybe in her late 40s in the study. I dismissed it as being the light, and that maybe I was still a little not right in the head from my experience in the tunnels. At this point, I was sure I had been hallucinating down there. I finished my cup of coffee after a brief conversation. I don't really remember a lot of what she said to me, but that feeling of unease grew and grew until I wanted nothing more than to be out of this church, so I could go find my car and get back to my motel room. "Why are you alone?" she asked, interrupting me as I said my thanks to her in an attempt to suggest that I should be on my way. "I'm sorry," is all I could reply. "Why are you alone?" she asked. "Did you choose this for yourself?" "Well, my friend Mike didn't think it was a good idea," I replied. unsure why I was even answering the question. "That doesn't answer my question," she stated. Her face was piercing and smooth. She was beautiful, easily in her 20s now. Her tone was becoming harsh. I started backing away, but I was compelled to answer. "I don't have anyone else," I stated. When I answered this question, everything else was gone. It was just me and her. I could feel her eyes burning into me, fierce and intense. Her mouth was a firm line. She didn't speak anymore. I could feel her words, more than hear them. The room was ice cold, and my skin was clammy again. "Why are you alone?" she asked again. Suddenly, my thoughts were a blur. Every friend I thought I'd made in high school was gone. There was Mike, yeah, but our friendship was entirely material now. There was no relationship there anymore. I hated John, not for good reason, but because I envied his success and prestige. My marriage had failed while I was in the military, and fearing my friends had sided with my ex-wife, I abandoned all of them completely. All of my military buddies? I was never fully honest with them about who I was, so I never gave them an opportunity to be a friend with me. I didn't even live near my family deliberately, just so I could be alone. I had pushed every other person out of my life, and I was really and truly alone. She was right in front of me now, her face next to my ear. Her hair was fiery red and skin ghostly white, eyes a powerful verdant shade of green. She was nude, and I suddenly realized that I was too. We were swimming together in an inky sea of black. It was oblivion. I was nothing. She was right there with me, but so far. I realized instantly that without her, it would be just me and my nothingness. I realized that one alone in the emptiness is themselves empty. "Good," she whispered. I knelt down and pressed my forehead against her bare belly. I felt her hands on my neck and shoulder. She began to kneel down slowly, and her breasts brushed my forehead. I felt an indescribable lust well up within me, but also fear. I knew that she wanted to hurt me. I could feel her eyes on me, like those of a falcon staring at a mouse. I wanted her to hurt me. I was in total submission. I wanted her to dominate me and redirect my meaning and purpose. The alternative was emptiness. Given the choice between emptiness and suffering, I chose the suffering. I first came to with a feeding tube in my nose, wearing those uncomfortable hospital clothes that never seemed to fit right or even stay snapped on. I have brief flashes of memory from before this, but I was so confused that I didn't really start to make sense of it for a few weeks. I was in isolation in what I would later find out was the behavioral health center for the VA. I spent a few days trying to get in touch with a social worker and talking to a therapist. They'd prescribed some heavy sedatives and antipsychotics for me to take until they could get me rational enough to start talking and potentially get a handle on what was going on with me. I discovered in my brief meetings with my psychiatrist and social worker that Mike had reported me missing to the police, and that I had been found rambling and babbling at a church. I had apparently also assaulted a 67-year-old woman who worked for the church. When they brought me in, my blood pressure was through the roof for a man of my age, and I was severely dehydrated. Otherwise, they couldn't explain my mental state. When I explained to them where I was, they started suggesting methane and carbon monoxide poisoning, and once my lab work came back, they confirmed it. Apparently, while I was down in those canals, I was exposed to a CHO co-leak and had started to hallucinate. I didn't think it made a lot of sense, until I later called Mike and had him drive up to help me get my car out of impound. We talked about it a little bit over the phone before I was released, and Mike had said that I had called him, but seemed pretty out of it after I passed through the canal the first time. When I told him that I was going back through, he was worried, but didn't think much of it until I didn't call him by that evening. He called the police early and reported me missing. Luckily, the police knew ahead of time that I was a vet, and by the time that they had me in lockup, they realized that I had no idea where I was and sent me to the VA hospital for treatment. The woman at the church didn't want to press charges for the assault, so I was released to physician's care. So I get cleared by my doctors after about 2 weeks in the hospital and have everything squared away with Mike to pick me up on the day of my discharge. Discharge at a VA hospital takes pretty much all day. You have to get signatures from a bunch of people, you have to check out all your belongings that you keep with you, and you have to speak with a series of social workers. The very last thing you do is verify that the possessions you brought in are all still there, and then they give you your shoelaces, pocket knives, etc. I'm standing in the visitation room with one of the orderlies, who is counting out my belongings and checking them off a list, when Mike walks in the door, escorted by another orderly. We count out everything I had on me at the time the police picked me up. 1 rucksack, 2 dry rations, unopened, 1 can pepper spray, 1 canteen, empty, 1 canteen, full, 11 pieces chalk, wallet, phone, 25 dead glow sticks,